In learning outcome 3, we're asked to understand the application of the whole life asset management. There's a lot written around the difference between price and cost as a general rule. And this learning outcome really focuses on that idea that we as procurement experts or procurement professionals should have a really good understanding of this difference between price and cost, and that price is what we pay for the goods from a supplier, whereas costs are the bigger picture. We'll come across terms like total cost of acquisition, how much it costs us to buy something, total cost of ownership, owning it over the lifespan, and whole life cycle costing. So when we look at this learning outcome, we start by talking about including all the costs, the purchase price through to disposal and end of life. We should understand that there are lots of different costs attributed to when we buy something. These can be called categories of costs. I'm always a little bit skeptical of that terminology because category can literally mean anything when we talk about costs. It could be categorizing direct and indirect costs. It could be categorizing fixed versus variable costs. It could be categorizing risk and price in regards to crowding around the different types of costs that we have. So I think it's really important that we understand what we mean by that idea of categorization of costs. I think a simple way and an easy way to manage that would be maybe to look at something like this, where we look at the different types of costs that are included. So pre-acquisition costs, all the costs that are taken before we actually buy something. So the fact that we might have to identify the need, we might have to go and research the market. Then we talk about the acquisition cost, that process of understanding exactly what we want, developing specifications, engaging with the marketplace, maybe going out and running tenders. Then we talk about installation, commissioning costs, the idea of bringing that product into the organisation. I always think it's much easier to contextualize this when we think about capital items, and that's how I would probably go about this. I would go into that exam with an idea of a large piece of machinery, a nuclear power plant, whatever you want to do, in order to get that idea and that understanding of that application. I think sometimes it's really hard to think about installation and commissioning and operating costs if generally we're buying raw materials and things like that. So when we talk about the whole life cycle cost, the first thing to consider is really we would only do this, and it comes across this in the learning outcome later on, this idea that we would probably only do this with high value assets, something that's like a capital piece of equipment, something that's going to be retained and used over a number of years within the business. So we'll have a look and we'll go through those all the costs that can be included. They don't have to be the costs that are necessarily mentioned in my slide deck. You could just talk about acquisition costs, financing costs. Financing costs are things like how much does it cost you to borrow the money to actually to buy those goods. If you have a mortgage, that APR rate is incredibly important to your overall cost. You might talk about maintenance costs, running it. And again, if it's something that you're really struggling with to contextualise, think about something that you would buy as a capital item for yourself. When we think about things like buying a car or buying a house, there are lots of things you consider rather than just the purchase price. You consider, as we said, the financing cost for if you're getting a loan, what the APR is. Maintenance costs for a house or a car is something that you can think about and contextualise. Things like the upkeep, the boiler repairs. If it's a car, then it's going to be something like your maintenance, your MOT, any ongoing servicing and things like that for the tyres. You might think about depreciation as one of those whole life cycle costs. Something like how much does that your car depreciate? And they say that we lose 30% the moment it drives off the forecourt. Is that depreciation standardised? Are you always going to lose 30%, or does it level off? How are we going to manage that and understand that depreciation cost? Other costs that you might have, obviously your acquisition costs, the cost of actually going out and finding it, to research the suppliers, understanding the marketplace, running your tenders, doing your site visits. So those are all going to be costs that we're going to incur. So just have an understanding of all those different costs, because the likelihood is the historical, they've asked questions like name some different costs other than price that you'd consider in the whole life cycle costs. And you could talk about financing costs, acquisition costs, maintenance costs, operation costs. You could talk about disposal, depreciation. All of those would be perfectly acceptable. Training as a cost. If you're buying a new piece of capital equipment, well, you need to have training to make sure that people can actually utilise and manage that. So that's one of the questions. And the other question, which we've seen in the sample paper for this unit, was the how would you categorise different types of costs? Now, for me, I would have a list in your head that you were going to use to manage that, whether or not that be from this slide, where we talk about acquisition costs, installation costs, maintenance costs. These would all be classed as categories of costs, or if it's from this slide where you've got your 8 different categories of cost. Either would be a perfectly acceptable way of being able to categorise costs. So including all the hidden costs, make sure that you kind of have it in your mind, whether it's an example of a car, a house, or a capital equipment that your organisation has spent money on. Just make sure you have that understanding. The next part of the learning outcome is to discuss the hidden costs of global sourcing. So this idea that if you are buying from abroad, then there are lots of other things to consider. The costs may be hidden costs that we might not consider. If you think about transportation, import duties, export duties, if you've ever bought something from abroad and then been surprised by the idea that you've got to go to the post office and pay an import duty, that's fairly common, and a lot of the people listening to this video will have experienced that. I know I certainly have. Insurance, your carriage charges, but there's so much more to consider. If you're going to start buying from abroad, what are the legal costs that are going to be incurred if you're having to deal with different legal systems, understanding the requirement there. We talked earlier about applicable law in one of the other learning outcomes. This idea that France operates different laws than us, is that going to cause us problems? Do we need to research, be aware of that? Who are we going to have to pay consultants, etc., to understand that? Will we have to pay consultants in regards to the language barrier? Are we going to have agents in different countries in order to ensure that we have that communication? Are we going to have to set up sites in other countries if we're going to start buying globally? So there's lots of things to consider when we talk about that. The cost of transport, the cost of the legal requirements, the cost of additional staff and understanding. Is there going to have to be costs when it comes to training our workforce within the cultural issues that they might face? I know certainly when I've gone to China and India and the Middle East, all of those areas require different skill sets, different understandings when it comes to the culture, and making sure that we're acting in an appropriate manner. So global sourcing, the risks associated with the extended supply chain, think about delays, think about having to hold extra stock, thinking about all of these things that we have to think about if we're buying from abroad. Okay. Only developed for larger purchases. Yeah, I think it goes without saying really that if you're going to be buying something that's worth the very low money, if we're thinking about Cralgic and we're thinking about those low value, low risk items, those routine purchases, Cralgic talks about this idea of functional efficiency, this idea that we should be as lean with as minimal waste as possible when it comes to those kind of products. The idea of building in this additional cost, this additional research, all of these additional costs would make those unfeasible. It would make it like inappropriate almost to buy to include all those costs. So we only develop for larger purchases. We develop it where it's going to be important to have that kind of information, that risk management, that top level support, where we start engaging with the top users to make sure that whatever we're buying, it's built in, that engagement across the whole organisation. Okay. We'll bring into that ensuring senior management support. Well, of course we need it. If you want to introduce something new, something that's large, something that's going to include the idea of understanding every aspect of the purchase. Well, the only way we're going to understand every aspect of the purchase is where we start talking to other team members, when we start talking to finance about depreciation, disposal costs, things like that. When we start talking to our technicians about and our engineers about utilisation and maintenance and operations and the requirements that we're going to have for those products. The only way we'll get that cross-functional support, the only way that we'll get it is if it's being pushed from the top level, if it's top down. This idea that the senior management are committed to it, so we can get that access and get that information, that people understand that this is what we're trying to achieve. So it's really important that that top level support's there to get that buy-in, to get that to push through the boundaries, to make sure that we're getting all the information that we need. We need the cross-functional support. These are high-value purchases. They're generally going to include lots of different people from lots of different areas within the organisation, from people utilising it, people using it, people developing it, people managing the costs like the finance team. So cross-functional working is really important whenever we talk about this idea of whole life asset management, because without engaging with the whole organisation, we won't get the information to make those calculations, to get that understanding of where all the costs are coming from. The moment we start talking about cross-functional teams, we start talking about this idea of how we develop cross-functional teams, and the idea that any kind of time that we have a team, we start talking about team theory. So with SIPs, when we talk about team theory, there's generally two theorists that we talk about when we talk about team theorists. So in order to have an effective cross-functional team to facilitate this idea, that team's going to have to be made up of the right people with the right skills. Whenever we talk about the right team members, the right team roles, we talk about Meredith Belbin. And he suggested that there are 9 different team roles, and in order for a team to be successful, we need people with different skills, different capabilities, to take on different roles within the organisation. For me, I just think it's easy for you guys, if you've done the Belbin test. I think it was something that was available. But if you haven't, then have a quick look through those team roles: plant, resource investigator, completer, finisher. Identify the ones that you think, identify your characteristics, identify the ones you think are definitely not you. If you can remember those, then it might give you an idea in the exam. For example, I'm a resource investigator, I'm a plant, I'm quite extroverted, quite good at solving problems, but one of my big weaknesses is that I am not what Belbin would call a completer finisher. I am not the devil's in the detail. I'm not that person that is really driven by detail. I'm quite holistic. I see a big picture, but one of my big weaknesses is that devil's in the detail. Now, knowing those kind of things, I could talk to you about why it's important to have different people with different skills and different within a team, and a cross-functional team, to ensure that it's successful. So we could talk about Belbin. That's a good thing to talk about when we talk about cross-functional team and team working, cross-functional success. We could also talk about Tuckman and Jensen, or I think your textbook just refers to it as Tuckman, and his stages of team development. In order for a team to be successful, we need a team to go through a number of stages. Teams don't hit the ground running in a perfect straight away. There's a learning curve that goes with it. So we talk about forming, storming, norming, and performing. This idea that you'll go through a stage where you're getting to know each other, nobody wants to rock the boat, and we're still just forming. Then once we establish ourselves, people will want to have their opinions heard, and we go through a storming stage where everybody wants to establish themselves. People need to understand their roles, so there'll be a bit of conflict and a bit of aggression, a bit of storming, if we use his terminology. Then it'll settle down, and we'll start to learn, we'll start to understand our roles, we'll start to get going and practice and trial and error to start understanding what works and what doesn't work. And then eventually we'll get to this idea that once we've done that trial and error, once we've done that learning, we'll be in that performing stage. So this idea that teams, cross-functional, team working, all of that comes together to make sure that we're getting that information, we're getting that understanding from around the organisation to understand the implications of these large purchases maybe that we're buying, and understanding the whole life cycle of it. Then we talk about this idea of decommissioning. Now, decommissioning is a far bigger term than just getting rid of something. Decommissioning is, we generally talk about where the implications of removing a product or removing a service that we're offering, and all the implications, and understanding the implications of that removal can take place. And we'll talk about the decommissioning, the 4 stages of decommissioning. I think there's a really good video on the virtual learning around the decommissioning of a nuclear power station, and the understanding of the implications of what the process they have to go through, and the things that have to be considered when we're decommissioning something as large as a nuclear power station. And that, for me, that's the example that I would be thinking about, or I would be using, or when going into that exam, that idea of understanding nuclear waste and understanding how they dispose of it and the implications of those things. So the removal and disposal process, again, that idea of that all comes part of this decommissioning, and the understanding that we need to have there. And then some of the legal aspects around waste management, things like the WEEE standards, making sure that we understand the environmental implications and the legal requirements that we have when it comes to waste. So, as I said, including all the costs when it comes to whole life cycle assets, these are all could be classified as categories of costs. So installation, maintenance costs, disposal costs, the reviewing and the historical performance and the analytics that go into understanding for our future needs, and how that's going to be impacted. That'll all cost money in the lessons learned. So you can either use those, or you can use this. And again, guys, if I'm being honest, you're probably going to get the SIPS rule of 5. They'll ask for 5 of something. So if you've got 5 key ones that you can talk about, and even if it's in a scenario-based environment, they'll always ask you. I think the sample question said, discuss the categories of spend that the table that they offered you in that sample paper would fit into, and some of the other costs that might not have been considered, or some additional costs that could be considered. So if you picked out these, you could put the table values into there, and then you could discuss further the things that might not have been in the case study, but they might want to consider. Okay. So, moving on to global and hidden costs. Well, there'll be costs related to the language barrier and getting consultants or translation services. There'll be costs incurred through the time difference and the delays and the implications of that, from the internal overheads of the staffing and training that might be required. There's lots of different, and again, guys, fairly simplistic, logistics, exchange rates. Pick out 5 that you can think. If you see that question about hidden costs, you've got 5 things that you've got programmed into your head from this list that you're going to talk about. Okay. Only developed for large purchases, of course, because I talked about this idea that it's you should generally only be developing this if we're talking about CrowdJIT for these more strategic purchases, because everything else doesn't warrant those kind of additional costs, that additional time, that additional effort. So when we talk about large purchases in regards to businesses, it might be your machinery, office building, vehicles, fleet. Those are the type of things that we're talking about, and those are going to be more strategic type items. Making sure that you've got the senior management and support. So if you don't have that support, then the authority to get the business case through, to make that progress, to get the funding that might be required. Making sure that senior management are bought in, so you'll get the commitment and the relationship and that facilitation from the other departments to support it and get it through. Okay. When it comes to team working, again, these are Belbin's team roles, but generally if you understand that the concept that we need different people with different skills and to take on different responsibilities and roles to make sure that any of our projects, any of our teams work successfully. And then we have our Belbin and our Tuckman. I was going to say it's Tuckman and Jensen. Whenever you see this model, you'll sometimes see it with just these 4. And that was Tuckman. Anything that's after those 4 is usually considered the additional work that Jensen did. So he's got the adjoining stage that once we hit that performing stage, complacency might set in. We might get that little bit more lethargic. We might get looking at the past. So that adjoining stage. Okay. So just make sure for me, if you get a question about teams, I'd be throwing in something about Belbin, I'd be throwing in something about Tuckman, I'd be throwing in this idea that you've got to understand that these are large value purchases. You're going to have that interaction with other departments to get that information, to get that knowledge, to push it through, to get that support. If we're talking about big capital equipment in the production team, we're going to need their support, their help, their buy-in to when we're getting really old and in with the new, that they're working towards and supporting us through that and not causing roadblocks. Okay. Decommissioning, I need you to know, if you get a question about decommissioning, I'd expect to see these words about understanding and preparing for the decommissioning, making sure you've got the resources, the process of what's going to be done, how it's going to be done, making sure your stakeholders know what's happening. I'd expect you to then be able to say about the idea of dismantling, taking the asset apart, removing any hazardous waste or fluids, removing from location, any processing that needs to be done in regards to the hazardous waste, and then disposal. Now, for me, if you've watched that nuclear power plant, you can pretty much adapt this to anything, but they might and could very feasibly just give you a scenario where they ask you about what would be involved in the decommissioning of said product within the scenario, and I'd expect you to come out with these terminologies: preparation, dismantling, processing and disposal. Okay. That kind of incorporates this idea of that disposal aspect, transport method, the risk, the environmental impact, the legislation, etc. So that, for me, they can only ask you, remember guys, questions around the learning outcomes. So they'll ask you about the different types. So I knew for a fact when that sample question about the categorizing of costs, because I knew it was from learning outcome 3, I knew that it was going to be including all the costs, which is the end of life. So if you can understand which of these learning outcomes it comes from, you can almost prepare what answers that you're going to get, because there's only a limited amount of things they can ask on each one. So if it's cross-functional support or team working, I'm thinking about Belbin and Tuckman. If it's decommissioning, I've got those 4 things programmed into my mind. If there's legal aspects of waste, understand about the legal implications, the WEEE kind of standards, etc., to make sure that you've got those kind of things to hand to draw upon. Okay. And that brings us to the end of learning outcome 3.